A pessimist, a Debbie Downer, a cynicist. I've been boiled down to these labels by friends, family, and teachers for years. I was constantly told by others that I was too overly critical, too negative, and too much of a buzzkill. Interestingly, I always found too much the opposite, not critical enough and way too peppy. These characterizations, however, very much carried their own weight, their own negative connotations. I'd shrug them off, but as I drifted off during class or in my room at night, I would mull over each and every word. They would replay in my head thousands of times. Was there something truly wrong with me? Did being too negative make me a bad person by definition? Was the only option to push down how I really felt and assume a more cheery and socially acceptable demeanor? So, I tried optimism once. It was exhausting. I'm simply not built for the willful ignorance it often requires. Now, if you were all shrinks, you might deduce that my pessimism was the result of a rough and often disappointing childhood. My mother and father failed to keep their word, promising to come to school events and being no-shows, constantly letting me down in every way possible. I spent a childhood watching doorways, hoping they would walk through. But the truth is, my parents didn't make me a pessimist. While they certainly shattered my idealism and forced me to mature much sooner than my peers, they didn't make me a pessimist. No, I did that all on my own, thank you very much. But what is so wrong with being one? The answer? Nothing. I therefore present the case for pessimism. Being realistic about the ugly truths of the world is not an undesirable quality. The sun will die in 5 billion years, 150,000 people die every day, 1.3 billion live in extreme poverty, and life will certainly not always work out in your favor. They may be tough facts to bear, but they are the truth. They don't change just because they make you uncomfortable or they are depressing. We live in quite the dichotomy, a hyper-optimistic society with cynical institutions. Optimism is often touted as the best and healthiest mindset one can have. Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates are commonly used examples of the successes of optimism. But the reality is that dropping out of high school or college doesn't usually work out that way for most. Here's another fact no one wants to admit. 75% of all crime in the United States is committed by high school dropouts. These highly improbable examples of successful and optimistic entrepreneurs hardly prove that optimism leads to more success in life. But it seems optimism is pushed almost everywhere we look. On social media, people have created alternative realities as they post carefully orchestrated images that make them seem happy and write captions about finding the good in all of the bad. Yes, Karen from Facebook, I'm talking about you. You're not fooling anyone. There are thousands of news articles that encourage people to be more optimistic, outlining the steps of how they can train themselves to abandon their pessimistic tendencies for good. In pop culture, many TV shows portray their characters in extremes. Think Eeyore the Grinch or Oscar the Grouch. Their over-accentuated behavior is so much more noticeable than their cheerier counterparts because optimism, even blind optimism, is more readily accepted and championed by society. Yet, the institutions that govern our reality are very much based on pessimistic or cynical ideas. Let's take our economy, for example. It's a capitalist market where it is assumed that businesses will work in their own self-interest in order to obtain the most profit. Why am I wrong for admitting that the same goes for people? It's not untrue that most people have an every man for himself mindset when it comes down to it. Most people run in the other direction in times of trouble, rather than stopping to help others. It's our innate instinct of self-preservation, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with admitting that about ourselves. Call it pessimistic or even cynical if you would like, but it's the undeniable truth. Now, you've likely heard the common expression about the glass and how optimists see it as half full and pessimists see it as half empty. both are true, but which perspective is more beneficial? I'd have to say the latter. The pessimist views the glass as half empty because they know the amount of drink in their glass is finite. It will run out in the future and they will need more. A pessimist is realistic and always cognizant of the future. An optimist, on the other hand, thinks little of the road ahead and suffers because of that lack of foresight. An optimist believes that everything will work out, and a pessimist knows it's very likely it will not. Being pragmatic is much more beneficial than walking through life with blind optimism. A pessimist is able to lower their expectations in order to avoid the crippling disappointment that optimists often face when the things that they were so sure would happen don't. After all, it is always better to either get what you expected or be pleasantly surprised. It helps pessimists recover from their failures much more quickly than their peppy counterparts. Contrary to what you might think, pessimism also helps with motivation. This is called defensive pessimism, a mindset in which people take their anxieties about a certain possible outcome and use that as motivation to avoid it. For example, believing that they will fail their chemistry test actually causes some pessimists to study harder and do better. This might seem surprising, but it actually makes a lot of sense. As journalist Catherine Pearson writes in the Huffington Post, quote, because a defensive pessimist's natural tendency is to envision specifically what the worst case scenario would entail, they're often motivated to try harder and therefore get a lot done. Pessimism also helps people later in life. One study concluded that while, quote, pessimism may be unrealistic and inaccurate in the lives of young people, and therefore becomes a risk factor for depression, the reality of life events may change such that extreme optimism becomes less realistic, and itself emerges as a risk factor for depression. The study illustrates that while pessimism in young people can contribute to depression, it is extremely beneficial for people as they age and have to overcome difficult times. Optimism becomes increasingly out of touch as people's idealism melts away, and left exposed is the rawness of the real world. Pessimism becomes a necessary evil, so to speak. Although you'll rarely hear about these benefits because it's so much easier to argue for optimism. But again, I ask, what is so bad about a healthy dose of pessimism? Now, you might be surprised that after all of this talk about pessimism, that I refuse to define myself by the label of pessimist. It's not because I'm ashamed of my beliefs or approaches, rather because I view myself as a pragmatic skeptic. It's in my nature to be immediately skeptical of overly simplistic or idealistic ideas. I will question everything and anything, and I don't think that's a negative. If that makes me too critical, so be it. I might be a pessimist by definition, but I reject the immediate assumptions that arise from the word. Pessimism is practically a dirty word nowadays, leaving a sour taste in everyone's mouths. It evokes images of depressed and angsty teenagers and grumpy old people. I don't believe the world is hopelessly doomed or that everyone is irrevocably bad, but I do think that we are all more likely to do what suits our own interests. It makes sense. Pessimists are likely not even the people you envision them to be. We've all been led to believe in absolutes, but the truth is, each pessimist is on a spectrum. Some are more pessimistic than others, and even the best optimists have pessimistic qualities. Being a pessimist is not something to be ashamed of. I'm a pessimist, you're a pessimist, each and every one of you is a pessimist, at least to some extent. But we don't need a label. And for all the Karens out there, I hate to break it to you, but pessimism isn't a mortal sin. I recommend you try it sometime. So, with that, Your Honor, the defense rests its case.